He sealed the letter with trembling hands, the wax still warm as the candle guttered beside him, and paused only long enough to press his signet before footsteps sounded in the corridor. Edward fairly folded the page with care, as though the paper itself could feel the weight of what he asked, then slipped it into his coat while duty knocked at his door. Downstairs, the carriage waited to take him away from the countryside he loved, and from the woman whose name he could not speak aloud. Clara Whitcomb stood at her window that same morning, watching mist lift from the fields beyond her father's modest estate. She had been waiting since dawn, listening for the crunch of hooves that never came, her hands resting against the cold glass. The night before, Edward had promised to write at once. His voice, low and careful in the garden shadows, still echoed in her thoughts, shaped by restraint rather than hope. They had met through circumstance rather than design, bound together by shared walks and borrowed hours while Edward oversaw his family's affairs nearby. He was the second son of a respected house, raised to honor and obedience. Clara, though well-educated, belonged to a quieter world, her future already discussed in terms of prudence rather than affection. From the first, they understood the limits placed upon them, yet neither could retreat without cost. Edward's summons came swiftly. His elder brother's health had failed, and with it any illusion of choice. He was required in London to assume responsibilities that left little room for sentiment. The night before his departure, he had walked with Clara beneath the yew trees, speaking of weather and neighbors, while everything meaningful waited behind their silence. When he left her at the gate, his bow was formal, almost distant, yet his eyes betrayed him. The letter he wrote that morning was his only rebellion. In careful lines he asked her to wait, not forever, but long enough for him to plead his case with his family. He did not promise happiness. He promised honesty and the intention to return. As he handed the letter to the household maid, he believed he had done all that honor allowed. Days passed, then weeks. Clara continued her routines, accompanying her father on visits, practicing her music, answering polite inquiries from a neighbor whose interest was obvious and approved. Each afternoon she returned to the window, measuring time by the path that led to the road. The silence grew heavier than any refusal. Edward in London waited as well. Each post brought news of obligations fulfilled and expectations set, but none from Clara. He assumed patience where there was only absence, and resolved to be worthy of her endurance. When autumn arrived and pressure mounted for him to secure an advantageous match, he held to the belief that her reply was simply delayed. Neither knew that the letter, mislaid among accounts and forgotten errands, rested unread in a drawer miles away, already deciding their fate. As the countryside shifted toward colder hues, Clara's hope thinned into something quieter, more cautious. She questioned her own memory, wondering if she had mistaken courtesy for feeling. Yet each evening, she placed a chair by the fire and imagined his letter arriving, imagined the relief of knowing her silence was not mistaken for indifference. In London, Edward stood often at his desk long after the candles burned low, composing explanations he could not send, unaware that his first words had never reached her, and that time, once patient, had begun to close its hand. Winter imposed its order upon them. Clara's father accepted an invitation to dine with the Harrowells, whose eldest son had recently returned from Bath with prospects and approval. Clara played her role with gentle civility, aware that each smile was a small concession to expectation. She told herself that Edward's silence was an answer, though she did not yet know the question had gone astray. In London, Edward's position hardened. His brother died quietly in February, leaving grief and responsibility in equal measure. With mourning came urgency. His mother spoke of alliances and estates, of stability after loss. Edward listened, his consent delayed by the belief that Clara would soon write, that he would have words to set against the plans laid before him. Each empty post tightened the circle around his resolve. When spring returned, Clara received a proposal framed as kindness. The Harrowell family promised comfort and respect, a future free of want. Her father, aging and tired, looked to her with an unspoken plea. That night, Clara walked alone in the garden, where the earth was soft and forgiving. She recalled Edward's careful promises, his refusal to claim what he could not secure. If he had meant to return, she reasoned, he would have found a way. Edward, at the same hour, stood before a sealed agreement, his name required to bind land and lineage. He asked for time and was granted little. A match was arranged, respectable and distant, with a woman of calm intelligence who expected duty, not devotion. Edward agreed, not from desire, but from the fear that his silence had already done its damage. He wrote once more to Clara briefly to say that circumstances had changed. He entrusted the letter to the same route, believing the first had been answered. Clara's reply to the Harrow proposal was measured and obedient. She accepted, setting aside the small defiance she had carried like a hidden stone. Preparations began with quiet efficiency. Invitations were written. Dresses altered. The house filled with voices that did not ask her heart's opinion. She moved through it all with composure, her grief refined into something private. The second letter from Edward arrived too late. It reached Clara's hand on a pale April morning, delivered by a rider delayed by illness and weather. She recognized his script at once and felt the room narrow around her. His words were restrained, formal, and final. He spoke of obligation, of paths diverged by necessity. There was no mention of waiting now, only regret shaped to fit propriety. She did not know that the first letter existed. She read the second as confirmation of her doubts and folded it with care, placing it among her keepsakes as one might lay a flower on a grave. That evening she accepted congratulations with steady grace. Edward learned of Clara's engagement through a mutual acquaintance weeks later. He received the news in silence, the truth settling with the dull certainty of law. He told himself that this too was honor. Yet in the pause before acceptance, he felt the weight of all that had been decided without either of them truly choosing. As preparations on both sides advanced, neither spoke the other's name again. The spaces where letters should have been grew into a shared absence, shaping their days. What they mistook for resolve was only surrender practiced carefully. The distance between them was no longer measured by miles or months, but by the quiet understanding that duty, once obeyed, rarely allows a return to what might have been. Spring passed and neither questioned the cost. Years later, on a quiet autumn afternoon, Clara found herself alone in the small room that held her papers and mementos. Marriage had brought her stability and kindness, though not the fervor of youth. Her husband was a good man, attentive in his way, content with what life offered. As she sorted through old letters, her fingers brushed a folded page she did not recall keeping. It was the first letter. Time had yellowed it, but Edward's hand was unmistakable. The maid who had once managed accounts, now long retired, had sent it with a brief apology, discovered while settling old drawers. Clara sat, the world receding as she read words written before choices hardened. He had asked her to wait. He had believed in their patience. The knowledge did not break her. It clarified everything. The silence, the doubts, the obedience that followed all resolved into a single irreversible truth. She had not been abandoned. They had been separated by chance and custom, by a moment's carelessness that history would never correct. Edward learned of the discovery through a letter written in Clara's steady hand. She did not reproach him. She did not ask for anything. She told him only that she had finally understood, and that she hoped he had found peace. The letter traveled without delay as though time at last wished to be fair. He read it in his study, now lined with the proofs of a life responsibly lived. His wife had died the previous winter, leaving affection and respect, but no children. Edward sat with Clara's words until evening dimmed the room. Grief returned, not sharp but profound, carrying with it the memory of a self he had been and a choice he had never truly made. They did not meet again. That too was a decision shaped by honor. To reopen what had been closed would have unsettled too many lives, including their own. Instead, Edward wrote once more, a letter of gratitude and farewell, acknowledging what had been sacrificed without naming it as loss. Clara read his final words by the fire, the letter resting in her lap like a familiar weight. She felt no urge to weep. What remained between them no longer demanded possession. It existed as memory refined by time into something enduring and calm. In the years that followed, she kept both letters together, not as symbols of regret, but as proof of a love that had been real, if brief. Edward, in his own quiet way, did the same. When he walked the grounds of his estate, he carried with him the knowledge that some affections are not meant to be fulfilled, only honored. Their story did not end in reunion or confession, but in understanding. Love, once sacrificed at the altar of honor, remained with them as a guiding presence, shaping their restraint, their kindness, and the grace with which they accepted what could not be changed. Occasionally Clara wondered how different her youth might have been had the letter arrived on time, yet the question no longer pained her. It served instead as a lesson in gentleness, reminding her to attend carefully to small duties, for they often carry the greatest consequence. Edward too learned to value the unseen turns of fate in moments of solitude. He acknowledged that love does not always seek reward, sometimes it asks only to be carried with dignity, informing the choices that follow, and the measure of restraint guiding his later kindness, patience, and acceptance thereafter, always quietly onward through life, remembered without bitterness or demand ever again henceforth.